2 weeks ago, the sermon I preached was on the first chapter of Philippians. It was the first of 4 Sundays in this lectionary year that we'll hear from Paul's letter, and we're going to take week 2 this week, and then week 3 and week 4. I called this a farewell letter from the Apostle Paul, and it has been seen in that light by many scholars. However, it is not an exercise in nostalgia, but rather Paul in this letter frames his farewell by looking to the future, specifically by looking to the future of the Philippian community, confident that God's work among and through them would continue. That's the primary reason that I've chosen to focus on these texts, these last weeks of my service with you at Trinity. This farewell that we are approaching is not evidence of an ending, but of God's continued work among and through you, or to use more directly Paul's language, of being confident of this, that the one who began a good work among you will bring it to completion by the day of Jesus Christ. However, Paul didn't just write this letter to say goodbye. Like every letter he wrote, he put pen to parchment to address a problem in the church. The issues presented through these 4 chapters is an interpersonal conflict between 2 women who were important leaders in the Christian community of Philippi. Paul calls for unity in the church, a theme addressed in today's reading, which is truly the theological heart of this letter and the theological center of Paul's understanding of what the incarnation of Jesus is all about. If then there is any encouragement in Christ, any consolation from love, any sharing in the Spirit, any compassion and sympathy, make my joy complete. Be of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. Do you hear the urgency of that plea? A personal problem between 2 people in a church can become a disabling divide for the entire congregation. Conflict that is unresolved, unrepented, and unforgiven can become like the spot of mold that you find on a piece of fruit. It can quickly spread throughout the entire batch, and what was once tasty and life-giving becomes fit only for use as fertilizer. Did you know that what we call the New Testament was not actually put together in its current form until 200 or 300 years after the events of Jesus' life? When our forerunners in the faith wrestled with the question of what to include as part of the canon, they used a few questions to evaluate the many, many writings that were available to them. Perhaps the most important one was, does this particular writing faithfully represent the faith that was handed down by the apostles? But another test was this: is this writing being used by the church, or does the church find it helpful? It says something, I believe, that Paul's letters pass muster on both of those fronts. His letters do faithfully reflect and were widely used in the Christian church, reflect the faith of the apostles, and used by congregations to try to address problems that arose. Their usefulness has been in part because there has never been a church without problems to address. Every congregation has its own history of church fights. Paul in this letter offers a way through those battles to a place where the good work begun among you can be brought to completion by the day of Jesus Christ. And just what is the roadmap for that journey? Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility regard others as better than yourselves. Let each of you look not to your own interest, but to the interest of others. Paul calls for unity, but not uniformity. And there is a big difference between the two. Unity is built on respect and commitment to a common set of values. Uniformity is built on the idea that one group's way of doing things is the right way, and everybody else has to learn to do it the right way. It's not a house built on respect, but rather on the idea of dominance. And it is quite frankly the way that I was taught as a child in school that America was supposed to function. We, of course, came from diverse places, but the goal was always for us to be melted down into a desired uniformity. Those who have been participating in our book study these past 6 weeks, reading Ibram Kendi's work, How to Be an Anti-Racist, have explored with the author the idea of this melting pot of assimilation, and have seen that it is problematic in that it does not value all cultures as equal, but chooses one culture above others as the best, highest, and the most desirable culture. And quite frankly, that culture is always mine. Although you might not agree with me because you might think it's yours. But collectively, we might think it's white culture. But even that statement is erroneous because there is no such thing as white culture. There are many, many white cultures in this world and in this nation. Paul fought this same idea in his day. The early church was a mix of cultures and classes. Early on, it was primarily a Jewish culture, though for Paul's churches, it was from the Jewish diaspora, that is, those who were not born or raised near or in the Jewish homeland. But present also were a growing variety of Gentile cultures, representing the whole diversity of the Roman Empire. Paul struggled his entire Christian life with some Jewish Christians who believed that Judaism was God's way, the right way, the only way. And anyone from outside that experience must assimilate into Israel first to be authentically Christian. Paul fought with this idea because he understood the truth of John's statement that God so loved the world that he sent his only Son. Not that the world was Jewish or Gentile, not that it was male or female, rich or poor, slave or free person. In Christ, all are one, just as they are one in Christ, saved by grace, justified as a gift without strings attached, especially the cultural strings that human communities always seem to want to use to tie others down. Instead, Paul asks the Philippians, and us who still hear God speaking through his words, to let the example for us be Christ himself. Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited. That is the New Revised Standard Version translation, the one we use in worship and the one we heard this morning. I think it's a translation that in this case has some holes in it that need to be plugged. One way to read that, and I would argue that it is the way it is most often read, is that even though Jesus was God, he chose in the incarnation to act in a way different from God, a way characterized by humility, obedience, and even a submission to death. It can be read in that light. I've come to think that that is the most understood way it is read because it coincides with our image of God, what we think God should be like. Now, this may be a little simplistic, but I hope it makes the point. For many, God is a superhero on steroids. No one is as great as God. No one is as fast as God. No one knows as much as God. No one punches as hard as God. God may be loving and just, but if you cross God, watch out. This is the God of the omnis, or the God of the alls. It's popular in our culture. God is all-knowing. God is all-powerful. God is all-wise and always or everywhere present. The problem is it's not really the God of Philippians 2. The verse I just quoted, I believe, is better translated in the New International Version of the Bible, which reads, Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God as something to be used to his own advantage. Jesus, in choosing incarnation, did not choose to act in a way that was contrary to God. Jesus chose incarnation and all that that implies, to be human, to be humble, to be subject to death, and even to die a terrible and scandalous death at that, like crucifixion. And he did it because that is the nature of God. That is what God is like. That is who God is. And so there is no great leap to understand that God would of course choose incarnation for our sake. Langdon Gilkey, a 20th century theologian who taught at the University of Chicago, as a young man was teaching English in China when World War II broke out. He was interred by the Japanese with other English-speaking civilians at a camp in Shantung province. And in 1996, he published a book titled Shantung Compound, The Story of Men and Women Under Pressure. Now, because they were civilians, the prisoners of Shantung Compound were allowed to organize and administrate life inside the wire. So they organized communal cooking, laundry services, they distributed medicine and staffed their own clinics, they held classes to educate their children, and they gave music concerts and music lessons, and also, because it was necessary to prevent disease, they organized the cleaning of the camp latrines. Now, the population in the camp was comprised of English-speaking missionaries and doctors, teachers, and business people from around the world. There were Americans and Canadians, Australians and New Zealanders, and of course, lots of British subjects from Great Britain and other corners of the British Empire. Gilkey, in his book, reflected on a difference he noticed between two groups of British women when it came to taking their turn at cleaning the toilets. The first group were those women who were new to peerage in British society. Some had married into the aristocracy. Others had husbands who had been knighted, and so they were given the title of lady. The second group were those who were born to the aristocracy. For generations, the women of their families had held the title and the privileges that came with it. Inside the wire of Shantung, the first group balked at the duty of cleaning the community latrines. Gilkey surmised that they remembered when they weren't important and saw such menial labor as a threat to their newfound status. The second group, in contrast, knew who they were, who they had always been, and who they would be once again when the war ended. They saw the task of cleaning toilets simply as a necessity for the survival of the community, and so they took their turn on toilet duty without complaint. Though imperfect, his observations do reflect what Paul had discovered about Jesus. His humiliation as a slave, as one subject to death, as one being crucified. None of that was a threat to who he was, to the core of his nature and his identity. And it is that example that Paul holds up to Christians involved in fights, power struggles, or other tussles in their community. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility regard others as better than yourselves. Let each of you look not to your own interest, but to the interest of others. The example of Jesus does not point to dominance and ideas of superiority. It points to a radical hospitality. It is not grounded on the idea that I know all I need to know and that what I know is right. Rather, it is grounded on, dare I say, a childlike curiosity that delights in discovering something new. It is not an identity that emerges from any part of what we call American civil religion, but rather an identity that emerges from the waters of baptism and how those life-giving waters connect us to the death and the resurrection of Christ. So, Trinity, as you move forward in faith, please remember when disagreements emerge. You can always be wrong. I know I often am. But you will never be separated from the love of God. You can always overstep by stepping on somebody else. But you can never outpace the grace of God, which embraces you in love. You can always hurt another member of the church. But for those hurts, there is always forgiveness, both to receive and to give, that is reflective of God's very nature. And dare I say it, your nature too.